this week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I think there's a few comments I haven't caught up with as yet, so hopefully I will do so either later today or during the week. Interesting. Chinese whiskey, I guess. Probably a bit too early to sort of make an overall assessment of the sort of Chinese whiskey industry, and certainly only having a small sample size to work on, you can't really sort of judge an entire industry by one distillery. But we'll see how things progress, and if Chinese whiskey does indeed become a thing, as they say. So anyway. On to today's episode of the show. Today's episode of the show is a viewer's choice episode of the show, so I'd just like to say a very, very big thank you to my good friend Andy Holbrook for the samples for today's episode of the show. And as you can see, it is a Glen Scotia episode of the show. Don't really need to go into a great deal of detail about the distillery, as I've done several episodes of the show on Glen Scotia. And I've always been a big fan of Glen Scotia. I mean, certainly I remember when I first started in the industry, I think the only available bottling was the short, dumpy green bottling with the, well, should we say, very Scottish label. I think it was an 8-year-old, I think. And then there was that sort of nondescript, I mean, when I say nondescript, I mean nondescript labelling and tubed, I think it was a 14, I think, had this kind of greeny coloured sort of nondescript tube and a sort of like a very basic kind of label, and that always seemed to be the kind of overriding thing that I got about Glen Scotia. Was not that nobody cared about it, but it was just kind of like sort of there. It was kind of just almost apologetically bottled, if you see what I mean. I know that probably doesn't make a great deal of sense, but it did seem that there wasn't an awful lot of attention being lavished on the distillery, and there's a number of distilleries even today that you kind of get that impression of. And then kind of things changed. There was a period, I think, of time between around about 2010 and 2015 when suddenly they just went completely crazy, and there was at least two, well, three if you include the final range change, I suppose, in 2015. And I mean, you must remember the tubes, the cow tubes, with all the different cows on them. I mean, they were quite cool, actually. But the thing was that suddenly you went from basically one bottle representing the distillery to suddenly you got this huge range. I think it was a no age statement up to about 21, I think. And it was interesting to sort of obviously see Glen Scotia across a different range of age statements, and there was always one or two in the range. I remember sort of the two refreshes they did. There was always a couple that just didn't quite float my boat, and more often than not, funnily enough, they were the mid-teens bottlings. And it appeared to me that sort of obviously young Glen Scotia, really good, really intriguing, sort of classic Campbeltown, intense, that kind of thing. And then sort of mid-teens got a bit stroppy, a bit like a teenager really, and kind of a bit recalcitrant and reticent and sort of, just not really showing an awful lot, to be honest with you. And then 21-year-old, 18, 21, absolute divine, kind of coming out the other side, I suppose, and sort of, suddenly flourishing. So yeah, maybe you could sort of say that Glen Scotia was a bit like a child, really, sort of great at either end and sort of a bloody nightmare in the middle. I obviously don't have children, so couldn't really comment, but that was the overall impression. And until they did the refresh. The last refresh, I think which was about 2015, which is when they brought in Victoriana and all that kind of stuff. And so you had the kind of like the double wood, which was okay, pleasant, interesting, variable depending upon how much sherry was used. 15, the 18, and obviously the Victoriana, which I've always been a big fan of. One of my favourite Glen Scotia releases, it has to be said. And so now it's kind of settled down since then, and we have a sort of fairly stable fairly stable core range with the obvious limited editions coming out every now and again. So anyway, so that's so Glen Scotia. You know, it's great distillery, really intriguing distillery. Obviously, sort of, you know, now being owned by Loch Lomond, and seem to be sort of, you know, going from strength to strength. So like I said, all samples for today's episode of the show came from my good friend Andy Holbrook. So without much further ado, let's take a look at the range. Okay, so we're going to kick off with, I suppose, what you would call the entry-level bottling. This is the Campbeltown Harbour, bottled at 40%. This is a post-2022 release, as it's obviously got the new label. So a lightly peated spirit, aged in first fill American oak. Then we're going to do quite a jump up to the 18, so this is 46%. So it's been aged in refill bourbon and refill American oak hogsheads, and then had 12 months finishing in first fill Oloroso, and this was a bottling from obviously last year. Then we're going to move on to the batch number, I think it's batch number 1, or certainly I think Andy wrote batch number 1 of the Glen Scotia Victoriana, bottled at 54.2. I think this was a 2019 bottling, and yeah, certainly I think that the ABV had changed at some point. I forget what time it kind of changed, but obviously this was one of the earlier ones at 54.2. Then we're going to move on to quite a special bottling, as you'll see from the title page. Now this is technically a 2009 Dunnage warehouse tasting 13-year-old, bottled at 54.9%, but not an actual Dunnage warehouse tasting bottling. It's essentially a private bottling. Andy had a email conversation after doing one of the Dunnage warehouse tastings with in McAllister, and this was the result. It was bottled specially for him. So it's medium peated spirit, aged in fresh bourbon barrels before being finished in Bordeaux red wine casks. Rotation 2019/359/2. So obviously that 359 being the cask number. So bottled, I believe, in October of 2022. So came my way obviously when Andy kind of gave me the samples back in February of this year. So kind of quite looking forward to that, as it's pretty much a unique bottling. And the final bottling is the seasonal release 12-year-old from 2021. This was heavily charred ex-bourbon and finished in ex-Oloroso, bottled at 54.7, and I believe bottled in late 2021. So looking forward to finishing off with that one. So yep, that's today's lineup. Let's kick off with a bit of Campbeltown Harbour then, shall we?
There's nothing truable in loving. Conquer your space.
Right, okay, so let's see what the Campbeltown Harbour gives us then, shall we? Quite a lot of oak. Sweet vanilla, fat, corn, malt, bit of brine, little estery fruit possibly, sort of, you know, kind of fleshy. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's a little heavy on the oak possibly. Yeah, I mean, what's not to like, I guess. It's not the most complex of noses, but it does what it says on the tin, I suppose. Anyway, let's see what the pal's like. Very oaky. Again, very soft, very vanillaed, very corny, very sweet. And it does kind of subdue to a certain extent the distillery character. It's just about there. as in maltiness, and certainly right on the finish you get that sort of Campbeltown salts, a little bit of oiliness, a little bit of Campbeltown oiliness coming through as well, malt returning, bit of peat smoke. I mean, it's all very pleasant. It's kind of sort of Campbeltown light, if you like. I suppose it's sort of obviously designed with, you know, drinkers that have never sort of like had a Glen Scotia before, to sort of lure them into the character without sort of giving it too much character, if you see what I mean. Yeah, it's pleasant. It is what it is at the end of the day. So yeah, not a bad one to start with. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 18-year-old. So refill bourbon and refill American oak, finished in Oloroso. Let's see what the nose gives us on this thing, shall we? It's a bit reserved. I'm kind of having to work it quite hard. There's obvious sherry notes, dried fruit, malt, bit of peat smoke, a bit of ash, marzipan. Again, it's all very, very oaky. I mean, I'm really trying to sort of, again, get the distillery character. Yes, there's a bit of maltiness, there's a bit of saltiness, but it's kind of, again, it's kind of, right, we've got to cover it all up. Why? You know, I don't get it. It's 105 quid, and is this nose 105 pounds worth of nose? Yeah, I'm kind of struggling with it, it has to be said. Like I said, just too much oak. I mean, again, the quality is pretty good, you can't argue with that, but it's just sort of like really not getting me particularly excited. Anyway, let's see what passes on. Soft, full, malty, coffeed. A little bit better balanced, I will say. Obvious creamy, sweet American oak and dried fruits from the sherry finish. Really salty, very, very salty aftertaste. It's got more expression on the palate. It's more expressive, it's more interesting, there's more distillery character. I'm still kind of struggling with it in terms of price, and out of the current lineup, I think I would personally gravitate towards the 15, roughly about, you know, £20 a bottle cheaper. Even saying that in the past I've often found the sort of the mid-teens bottlings to be a bit stroppy and a bit reserved. This one certainly on the nose wasn't really giving an awful lot away. Maybe that was more about the overt use of oak rather than the spirit being a bit stroppy, because certainly the spirit came through really, really nicely on the palate, and certainly, but only really on the finish. That's the thing. Again, it was all kind of oak up front. And yeah, the oak kind of did eventually kind of run out of steam to allow the sort of like the distillery character to come through. But again, it just, yeah, wasn't quite sort of hitting the buttons, I think. But you know, like I say, quality wise, you can't disagree with it. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Victoriana. So obviously no age statement and bottled at 54.2%. Ah, now we're cooking on gas. This is more like it. This is Glen Scotia, plenty of distillery character, not a huge amount of oak, just kind of sitting back. It has that lovely classic malty, oily, lightly peated, slightly sort of burnt earth, Campbeltown funk, although again it's not sort of like, you know, horrendously funky. There's just that element there, you know, that just sort of like says, yeah, this is really intriguing. Coffee, bruised apple, baked apple now, more malt, touch of marzipan, dark marzipan, along with some oxidised fruit as well. Absolutely stunning, stunning whiskey, it has to be said. And like I said, ever since its inception, I've just been a huge fan of the Victoriana. It just basically, it just encapsulates Glen Scotia. It says everything I wanted to say about Glen Scotia, and you know, the oak is supportive, it's subtle, it's there, but it's not kind of like the be all and end all. God, I sniff this all afternoon, it has to be said. Let's see what that's like. Oh, that's stunning. I mean, that just kicks off with sort of earth, a little bit of earthy peat, violets, vanilla, malt, and then we kind of move into the sort of like the sort of oxidised fruit, dark spice, a little bit of licorice, more malt, nice building peat on the mid palate, moving into the finish. Quite salty again on the aftertaste, a little masked. I could personally drink that neat without any problem whatsoever. I mean, the alcohol really is kind of emphasising the saltiness on the finish. It really is kind of giving it a lovely intensity. It lingers, the malt is kind of sitting in the sort of like the edges of the mouth, and it is just stunning. Let's put a little drop of water to see what that does to it. Okay, so it's a little sweeter now, getting a little bit more vanilla, but again, not overt. Possibly a little bit more maltier. I'm almost getting a kind of berry fruit note, which is a little bit left field, it has to be said. Some green fruit as well, almost kind of green gagey kind of notes. Almond. I mean, neat, diluted. Stunning, absolutely stunning. I just love the way the nose has changed, but not overly changed, if you see what I mean. It's still obviously noticeable, Glen Scotia, but it's just brought out a few more nuances by adding a drop of water, and it just goes to sort of show the quality of the spirit that's being produced at Glen Scotia. You know, please don't hide it under all this bloody oak, you know. And thankfully you can buy this bottle, and it isn't, and it is just stunning. Let's do the pass right now. Okay, it's a touch more oak now. It's softer, it's more vanillaed, a little bit more oxidised fruit, a little sweeter, maybe not quite so sort of Campbeltown funky, not quite so salty. Certainly, no, I mean the salt is there, but it's nowhere near as emphasised as it was when it's neat. Personally, prefer the palate without adding any water. I just want that sort of Campbeltown salty intensity, and putting a little drop of water does kind of just knock that intensity off. But either way, an absolutely superb bottle. Right, okay, so let's move on to the privately bottled Dunnage tasting bottling. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end. We're kind of back to, not totally back to the 18, but we're back to the heavy oak again. It's kind of, I really can smell that bourbon oak, fat, corny. There's an intensity of red wine, sweet red fruits, a little bit of earth, almost astringent kind of rye notes as well. No, where's the spirit? I mean, this is, again, it's kind of like lots and lots of oak, clean oak, intense oak, but it's kind of a little too heavy for the spirit, you know, and okay, yeah, there is a bit of maltiness there, there is some saltiness, and yeah, it's interesting, it's intriguing, but again, it's very heavily oaked, and to me, is kind of hampering the character of the spirit. I mean, again, the quality is pretty damn good. You know, you can't complain about the quality, but it's just, again, the balance for me personally has just shifted too much into the oak spectrum. But you know, we're all different. We all have different takes on these things. But anyway, let's see what the pad's like. Again, it's a tale of two oaks. I mean, it kicks off with that sort of sweet, sort of corny, soft vanilla marzipan, and then almost pretty much straight into those sort of jammy, juicy red fruits, strawberry, raspberry. I mean, the purity of red fruits is just unbelievably good. But again, I'm asking, where's the distillery character? For a fleeting moment on the mid palate, I get a bit of salt, I get a bit of peat, I get a little bit of malt, but then it's just kind of bookended by the oak, and the sort of the kind of distillery character is jammed quite thinly in between the two oak characters. So I want to love this whiskey, I really do, and it has some lovely points to it, like I said, the purity of the oak, all that kind of stuff, but it just loses me somewhat in the fact that it is too much of oak and there's just not enough distillery character. Let's put a little drop of water with that and just see whether that actually addresses the balance or not. No, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference to the nose, to be honest with you. It's a little softer, but I'm still getting a lot of that kind of sort of rye spice, sort of astringent rye spice, a soft vanilla. If anything, it's kind of maybe lessened the red wine notes a little bit. Let's see what the pad's like now. Very much as it was neat, maybe a little softer, maybe a little less intense, maybe there's a little bit more maltiness and more toastiness, more toasty oak in actual fact. The finish is still wonderfully juicy and soft and all this lovely red fruits and jamminess and that kind of thing, but there's just, to me, there's just something missing here, and the missing bit is the distillery character, I'm afraid. But apart from that, you know, impressive whiskey.
Too many options. The hand that rocks the
Right, okay, so on to the final whiskey of the afternoon. So the seasonal release 12-year-old, heavily charred ex-bourbon, Oloroso finish. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Okay, so it's quite meaty, meaty, earthy, malty, so that's kind of a good sign. So we're getting sort of like, you know, the distillery character kind of front and centre. The oak is quite nicely integrated. It's I'm getting the sort of the toasted notes, but they're not overly toasted. And I did kind of wonder, looking at this and thinking, heavily toasted oak, you know, and we're going to get a lot of charred wood, a lot of intense wood, and I think the balance is not too shabby actually. It's got some oiliness, it's got a little bit of saltiness, there's some smoke, touch of violets, there's a little bit of dried fruit. Yeah, so overall I think the balance is pretty good. It's not quite, it certainly doesn't quite match up to the Victoriana on the nose and the intensity of the Victoriana, even though, you know, we're talking very, very similar ABVs. The oak certainly is more noticeable than it is on the Victoriana, but it's not overly oaky. It's not as oaky as, say, on the 18 or the Dunnage warehouse bottling. So, yeah, okay, I can live with this. This is maybe, you know, not a bad bottling. Let's see what the pal's like. Oh, that's chewy. That's chewy. That's malty. It's briny, earthy, dark fruits, bitter oak. Oh, that oak is bittering like hell on the finish, but wrapped up in that sort of saltiness with a little bit of peat thrown in. Oh, that's got some intensity, it has to be said. Again, maybe not quite at the level of the Victoriana, but pretty close. I mean, you can't argue that it is displaying some distillery character. It's displaying plenty of bloody distillery character. And you know, the oak kind of kicks in first, and then just goes, right, okay, that's it. We've done our bit, and in comes all of that sort of wonderful maltiness and saltiness, and quite cleanliness as well. Actually, there's not really an awful lot of funk going on there. Wood smoke right on the finish, wrapped up nicely with the peat smoke, really complex. Very, very impressive bottling, it has to be said. Not quite as impressive as the Victoriana, but, you know, pretty much close to it, I think. But let's see what a little drop of water does to the nose. Okay, so it's kind of brought out a little bit more of the American oak. I'm getting a little bit more wood char. And it's kind of lightened it. It made it, it's fishier, I guess. Not quite so dense and malty and woody. Although in saying that, like I said, there's a lot more vanillans as opposed to sort of like, you know, darker wood notes. Yeah, I like it. I think I prefer the note neat. I prefer the nose neat. Let's see what it passes like. Softer, maltier, slightly more coffee, maybe some more toffee. Still got that astringency there, saltiness, maybe not quite as intensely salty, but a lot maltier, a lot richer and fuller and softer and rounder. And yeah, I mean that's a lovely mouthful at the end of the day. I mean, it lingers really, really well. Yeah, nice sort of slightly earthy, dry peat kind of finish to it. Yeah, I mean that works really well. I think that's a very, very impressive whiskey. Personally, again, I liked it neat. I just liked that intensity. But I think whether you choose to have it diluted or undiluted, it's still a really, really good bottling. So yeah, good one. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So before we sum everything up, just again a big thank you to Andy for samples for today's episode of the show. I hope you think that this has been a fair appraisal. I mean, you know, that's the thing, you know, it's just because something happens to be a limited edition or whatever, you know, I'm going to give it a kind of a fair crack at the whip, shall we say. And the Campbeltown Harbour, well, yeah, okay, so it has its place, shall we say. It's not my favoured bottling by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't have the complexity, it's too oaky, there's not enough distillery character, but I can see the point of it. And that is what it all boils down to at the end of the day. Not everything is going to appeal to me or to you, but you kind of have to look at things in a sort of kind of holistic overall kind of picture, and you can, and you know, certainly for the Campbeltown Harbour you can see its place and its point. I wish I could say the same thing about the 18-year-old. I really can't see a point in it whatsoever because it's just too oaky. There's not enough distillery character. It's not interesting enough for me at all. It's it's not too expensive. It's as it is, you know, this is the price of 18-year-old whiskies these days, and I suppose if you're looking at sort of the price to, you know, cost ratio, then yes, all right, I suppose you can justify it. But when you've got the 15-year-old, which I think is a far better, or for me a far more interesting whiskey at 20 quid less, I'm going to go for the 15. I'm not going to go for the 18. And you know, I think I've obviously stated the reasoning why. Victoriana, without a shadow of a doubt, the whiskey of the afternoon. It is just quintessentially Glen Scotia. You know, if you really want to know what Glen Scotia is all about, buy that bottle. Don't bother with the Campbeltown Harbour because it's just, you know, Campbeltown light. But the Victoriana just gives you the distillery character in spades, and it is just an absolutely stunning whiskey, as to be said. And it's cheaper than the 18-year-old. You know, not that we want to labour the whole kind of price thing. The warehouse bottling. Now, I mean, I know this is a very special bottling for Andy because of the sort of the connotations of it, and the fact that, you know, that it was bottled by Ian specifically for him, and yeah, and I'm pretty certain that he loves it. Yeah, it's a good quality whiskey. To me, it's just too much oak, not enough distillery character. Like I said, the meat in the sandwich was far too thin, in my personal opinion, and I like my meat, as they say. So yeah, interesting. Don't know how it compares to sort of other previous Dunnage warehouse bottlings, because obviously I've not tasted them, but you know, like I said, I just keep coming back to the Victoriana, and you know, it's kind of, there's no competition there whatsoever. The seasonal release, yeah, I mean, I liked that. I thought that was a good bottling. I thought the balance was better, and I know I go on and on and on about balance, but to me that is just such a key part of any whiskey, is the balance of flavours between the use of the oak and the character of the spirit, and so on and so forth. You know, to me that is probably the most important thing that I look for in a whiskey whenever I taste a whiskey, and it doesn't matter whether it's an inexpensive whiskey, a limited edition, a ridiculously expensive whiskey, doesn't matter to me. You know, what I'm after is balance, and you know, I thought the balance was okay. It wasn't too bad with the seasonal release, so we kind of finished on a high note, so to speak. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you think it was a fair look at Glen Scotia, and sort of, you know, what the distillery is kind of offering. And yeah, that's, like I said, that's this week's episode of the show done and dusted. So all that's left to say is good afternoon, and no, it's not quite afternoon yet. Ooh, brew for breakfast, Glen Scotia for breakfast, or breakfast of champions, Glen Scotia for breakfast. Anyway, until next week, good dramming and good afternoon.
Fighting in the